Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to Kinship. Welcome to another of our finance seminars. My name is Nigel Asquith. I'm director of the Kinship Conservation Fellows Program. But this webinar is not about me. It's going to be moderated by Ricardo Bayan, and David and Cecilia will tell us all about their experiences. So Ricardo, I'll just pass straight on to you. Welcome again.
Thank you, Nigel, and thank you everybody to another installment of Case Studies in Conservation. Today we have a really interesting subject that we're going to be talking about, which is the whole concept of standards and verification. We've all heard a lot about markets for ecosystem services, whether they're carbon or water or biodiversity or what have you. And I think what a lot of people forget is that for markets to work, you need trust. You need trust in what's being sold. You need trust in who the intermediaries are. You need all kinds of mechanisms that enable that trust. And, you know, for stock markets, you have the SEC, you have all these sorts of other institutions that are designed to increase and enhance trust. But environmental markets also need institutions to enhance and create trust. And I think that is the role of standards organizations. Today, we're very lucky to have David Antonioli and Cecilia Simon from Verra, which is one of these standard organizations, one of the, I think, most innovative and interesting of these standards organizations in these markets. And as you'll hear, they do much more than just create the standards. They work to develop these markets in lots of different ways. I think what's interesting about Verra is that it started in the carbon markets, and it used to be called the Voluntary Carbon Standard. And it changed its name to Verra because it was looking at a bunch of different markets beyond carbon and things going forward. But I would get ahead of myself. First, for those of you who don't know me, Ricardo Bayan, I'm a partner and founder at a group called Encourage Capital. We're an impact investment firm headquartered in New York, but I'm in San Francisco. And now I'll turn it to David and Ceci to introduce themselves. I should add that Ceci is a Kinship Fellow as well, so it's great to have Kinship Fellows speaking to us. Lots of good people have gone through the Kinship program, and Ceci is one of the best. So let's start with you, David, if you could just do a brief introduction.
Sure. Thanks, Ricardo, and thanks, Nigel. It was certainly a pleasure to be here, and so hopefully you guys will learn something today. I'm the CEO of Verra, and I've been here for 12 years. When I took the job, I thought it was going to be a 5-year job, and that in 5 years we'd be able to turn the lights off, close the door, and declare victory because all of the world's climate problems would be resolved, and you would need kind of another standard, and that all of the emissions around the world would be regulated. I actually did believe at one point that we would each have our little carbon card, we'd have a carbon budget for every individual, and we'd be off to the races. The problem would be solved. But lo and behold, we're not even close to that. And now the space that the VCS occupies, the voluntary market, has become, kind of a real driver of a lot of innovation. And I think now is poised to be one of those critical tools as we advance towards not only meeting the targets of the Paris Agreement, but going beyond. Why should we stop at 1.5? So hopefully today I can kind of explain to you a little bit about what we do, some of the ins and outs, and put in context the role that we play in this growing market, and what we do more broadly beyond just carbon, what we do in kind of in a broader sense from a more sustainable development impact perspective. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Ceci?
Hello, everyone. It's great having you in this webinars that Ricardo so greatly organizes. I'm Cecilia Simon. I am the Senior Program Officer for RED Plus and AFOLU at Verra. I joined Verra a few months back. I'm very happy to do that. Before that, I've been working in the carbon world for many years, for over 10 years, trying to understand how that works, how the carbon markets work, very centered on forestry. So I'm happy to be here and have a chat with Ricardo and David.
And I should add, obviously, Ceci's being very modest. If it wasn't for her, these case studies in conservation wouldn't be happening. So thank you, Ceci, for all the work you've put into making this a reality. So let's start with you, David. We'll talk for 30, 45 minutes and then have an opportunity for questions. Folks, you'll see that you have a questions tab on your control panel. Feel free to type in your questions. The way it'll work is I'll call you out, then you can unmute yourselves and ask the question. But just type them in so I know who wants to ask what kind of questions, and I'll try to organize things that way. But let's start with you, David, giving us a little bit of background and history on Verra, where it came from, how it's developed, and how we find ourselves here. And if you can talk a little bit about the role that standards play, or you see that they play in the development of any ecosystem service market or environmental market.
Sure. Yeah. So do we have the slides? Those might be useful as I start to explain something. It's great, fantastic. So if you could go to the next slide, this shows the wide variety of standards that we manage. But if you can go to the next, sorry, there's maybe some animations in here. Perfect. What does a standard setting body mean, and what do we do? And the way I like to describe it is that we're in many ways the glue that holds these markets together, in the sense that kind of the rules and procedures that we write give confidence to investors that they can actually invest in something and have a positive outcome at the end of the process. And so, from a nuts and bolts perspective, it really means that we spend a lot of time writing rules that nobody likes. And I say that somewhat in jest, but what I mean is that if we were to write rules that were incredibly strict and onerous and really, had everything about environmental integrity all built in, and that was the only thing they looked at, the NGOs would be raving about them and saying they were great. But the private sector would just look at them and say, walk away, because they couldn't do it. And if we wrote rules that were super loose and didn't have any environmental integrity, the NGOs would be complaining and the private sector would be saying they were great. So we have to find a middle ground to find something that actually works on the ground, but delivers the environmental and social outcomes that we need. So that's what I mean by being the glue that sits in the middle of transactions, large and small, right? So if it's a project that's delivering, efficient cook stoves to communities in isolated communities, or conserving forests, or even a project that's capturing and destroying landfill gas, you need a set of rules to govern that, particularly when you're thinking about something like a greenhouse gas emission reduction. You can't literally touch it, so you need to have confidence that the rules give you a measurement that's both real but also is consistent across different types of projects. So what you see here are the various standards that we manage. The focus of the conversation today will probably be the verified carbon standard, but as part of that, we have a jurisdictional and nested RED framework that looks at jurisdictional RED and how you actually develop programs at the government level, but how you also integrate individual projects. And Ceci is kind of one of our experts on this. So if you have any questions about jurisdictional and nested RED and how that works, Ceci will be able to answer those effectively. We also serve as a registry for the government of California in the implementing of their program. And we also have two broad sustainability standards, if you will, the climate, community, and biodiversity standards, and the sustainable development verified impact standard. And these are really about how you are able to demonstrate that projects are generating, on the one case, benefits for communities and biodiversity, and on the other, directly related to the SDGs. So a lot of projects use both. So they'll use the VCS standard to generate a carbon credit, but they will label it with the climate, community, and biodiversity standards. And increasingly, we're starting to see even more interest on the sustainable development verified impact standard, just because that's really the currency of the day in terms of where interest is coming, in terms of being able to report what the outcomes of projects are beyond the greenhouse gas impacts. And we have a couple of other standards which are listed below. Landscale is an initiative looking at broad landscape sustainability, not just carbon. And the 3R initiative is going to be soon turned into we're going to have a plastic standard that's going to enable projects to invest in activities that recover waste plastic from the environment and get credit for them as a way to drive finance to basically collecting a lot of the waste plastic that's got absolutely no value, but it's sitting in our waterways around the world. So that we're very excited about that. But again, what we do as a standard, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, David, but I think 99% of the people out there know RED and what RED is, but for the few people that may not, it's reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation. Basically, how do you get carbon from avoiding deforestations in places like the Amazon or elsewhere? And Ceci mentioned AFOLU, which is agriculture, forestry, and other land uses. So how do you get carbon from land use changes? What are the things there? I wonder if I could push you to sort of take us back to the world before standards emerged, David. I remember that, you know, one of the big questions in the first round of carbon that was ever sold, you know, God, it must have been like in the 80s, 90s, you know, before there were standards. And there was always this issue of like, can anybody just say, hey, I reduced emissions, give me credit, pay me money? And obviously people were like, well, that doesn't make sense. That's silly. How do we know if you've actually reduced emissions? So maybe you can give us a sense of like how the process has developed and evolved and where we are now in terms of how do you know? How do you guys give people certainty that a carbon credit is a carbon credit?
Yeah, I mean, there's a long history of this, and when I get a chance, I'll look for a recent graphic that's been put together by a number of people in the voluntary market that kind of describes this evolution of the market. But what we've really, you know, there was the early days where it was exactly as you described it. Some people saying, hey, I can actually develop a project. I'm gonna, you know, do this. There were a lot of these were actually forest RED projects, right? Projects that conserve forests that were under imminent threat. And they're saying, can we get paid for this? And people started asking all sorts of questions like, well, how do we know that the forest would have been, you know, really destroyed? In respect of land-based projects or AFOLU projects, the real question was, well, if you protect it today, what if that forest actually gets cut down or catches fire in the future? How do I ensure that what I paid you today for is going to be permanent and I can continue to get credit? And if that forest goes up in flames, that my purchase of the credit doesn't mean that my claim also goes up in flames. So over time, the markets have really been working at addressing some of these issues. And that's actually a really good example. The land-based credits or AFOLU credits were largely kept out of what became the largest, you know, carbon crediting program in the world, which was the Clean Development Mechanism under the UN that began on the back of, you know, the ratification of the Kyoto Protocol and allowed projects to generate credits that could be used by companies that were regulated under the European system, the EU ETS, and could actually buy credits to meet those compliance obligations. But that market said, we're not accepting land-based projects because we are not confident that they're going to be permanent. There are also issues around leakage, right? So if you take a forest and you protect that particular area, people were concerned, well, you're just going to make the drivers of deforestation go next door. And so these were all sorts of issues that had to kind of be grappled with and sorted out and resolved in order to bring these credits into the market. So just by way of example, what we developed on the back of a lot of research that had been done already was to address permanence. We said, well, why don't we require every project that has this characteristic, meaning that it could actually be reversed, require a certain percentage of the reductions that you achieve to be set aside and put into an account. And if there ever is a reversal, we'll go back into that account, which is fully diversified across all of these projects around the world. And we'll cancel out those units to make sure that any reductions that were transacted on the market are legitimate. And that's what is now called today the buffer pool. And it's a mechanism that's been accepted by California and developed for the Californian market, and is now kind of broadly recognized.
Like a self-insurance mechanism, right? It's a self-insurance.
Exactly, it's an insurance mechanism. And as we go forward, if the markets continue to grow, I would imagine that in the future, you'll have insurance products. Actually, one of the things that we hear from our project developers is saying, you're taking too many credits away, but we have to make the buffer system work as it is. But maybe in the future, there will be, more insurance products that could actually help reduce the cost, because essentially it's a cost, right? Projects have to set aside anywhere between 15 and 20% of their reductions into this buffer account, which is a lot. So that's just an example of that. So over time, the market started developing kind of these rules and procedures. And actually, maybe if we flip to a couple of slides ahead, go to the next one, please. Again, sorry, go through these. There we go, that one. So over time, where we've come to, and I think this is how our program works. This is probably very similar to how the gold standard works, the climate action reserve. We all have basically a set of kind of what we would call the standard, which sets out the basic requirements of what a carbon credit is. And it includes stuff like, well, it must be audited by an independent third party. You must only issue credits to projects. The credits that you issue must only already have happened. Like, you can't say, I'm going to plant a tree, I'm going to generate the credits over 20 years while the trees grow. You can only claim what you've been able to demonstrate has already happened. You need to use conservative numbers whenever you're looking at parameters or have data that has some sort of uncertainty to it. So that's the standard. And then you have basically 3 programmatic elements around it. The first one is accounting methodology. So again, if you have a project looking at a landfill gas or a reforestation project or an avoided deforestation project, the kinds of data that you're going to have to capture and report are going to be very different. And so all programs need to have rules around how you develop those accounting methodologies. Second, you have to have rules around who can audit, right? One of the key things in the standard is you must have an independent auditor. And so therefore you have to have rules around who can audit, what sort of training they need to have, what sort of accreditation they need to keep, and how we as a standard setting body can oversee their work. And then finally, you need to have a registry system where all of the information behind every project is listed on a transparent basis. But this, Ricardo, back to your original question, is something that kind of we've evolved over time to come to an agreement or an understanding that these are the basic things that you need to provide rigor. Because in the early days, it really was about someone saying, hey, I've got a carbon project, will you buy it from me, right? And people started asking these questions like, how do I know it's real? How do I know it's going to be permanent? How do I know you've addressed kind of the leakage concerns, right? How do I know that the meter is actually capturing what we needed to capture and that it's calibrated properly? All those kinds of things have been a series of, interventions, projects, insights, scientific data that's gone into creating these standards. And, like I'd say the example today is obviously the VCS program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think what's fascinating is that, we're familiar with standards and things like organic or other things where you have, at least in the case of organics, it wasn't always that way. It started off with entities in California developing themselves, much like the VCS, but then the U.S. Department of Agriculture kind of developing its own organic standard, which then became de facto the one in the market that you see stamped on a product in the US, and you can say, okay, I believe it's organic. And obviously, depending on how you view the USDA's organic standard, you may think it's great or you may think it's not as good as you would like it to be. But what was interesting was the way VCS started off as self-organized groups of people who were interested in the carbon market from a variety of different perspectives, coming together and saying, hey, what are the fundamental entities we need to give trust in carbon to the market? And kind of figuring out that you need it to be real and measurable, you need it to be verifiable, i.e. somebody's got to be able to verify that you've done what you've said you've done. You need to set up this independent auditing mechanism, third-party auditing mechanism, and then you need to put it all in a registry so that if somebody says, I generated 10 tons of carbon and I'm selling it to, you know, Coca-Cola or whoever, I don't turn around and sell those same 10 tons to Nestle because nobody's keeping track of where those tons are going, right? And that's the role of the registry. So all of these things have evolved, and it's become a really robust mechanism now in the VCS and in Verra. There's other work around how do you develop a standard? How do you measure? How do you know it's real? How do you have the accounting systems in place? And I think it's a lesson for many other markets. And I think you're looking at markets for other ecosystem services, whether it's mitigation banking in the US or water down the line or plastics down the line. You know, you can again say, how do we know? How do we know it's real? How do we know it's measurable? How do we know it's verifiable? Who gets to do the third-party auditing and accounting mechanisms? And all of these things are kind of common to markets. And I know that you guys came up with an approach to how do you come up with a standard. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how these standards are developed and who develops them, and the process for that.
Sure. But by the way, I was trying to capture the URL for this website. For some reason, I can't drop it into the chat for some reason. I don't know what's going on, but if you wanted to drop it in, it's actually, yeah, Cecilia, I'm going to send it to you. If you could pass it on to folks, that would be useful, because I think that's a useful reference for folks, because it kind of talks about this evolution. But to answer your question, Ricardo, about who develops these standards, in many ways, they are developed, you know, I'd call it, in many ways, they're open source. So one of the things that we thought about when we first started the VCS is that, you know, as a small organization, we didn't have the technical capacity to cover the wide range of activities. And this really played out in the developing of methodologies. So, you know, we didn't have the technical capacity to develop an accounting methodology, you know, whether it was in forests or renewable energy or industrial gas or whatever application. So we relied heavily on the market to kind of use our rules, which required someone to develop the methodology and have them be overseen and approved by two independent validation and verification bodies or auditors. And that was kind of our initial take of how we started to develop that. Over time, we've learned that, you know, the two independent auditing processes were not necessary, and that one was really enough, but that we needed to play a more active role. So we actually have started to build out some technical capacity. Ceci is probably one of the best examples of that, right? We are doing a ton of work on RED, and so we realized that we needed to bring on staff some expertise in order to oversee not only the development of methodologies, but the requests that we get from project developers, but also requests for registrational projects. So we need to, you know, look at the baselines and really start to dig into kind of the fundamentals of projects to make sure that that the projects are doing what they say they are, and that we can, you know, keep a close eye on that. But in many ways, you know, so what we did, I think, effectively was create the framework for the private sector to participate and provided the rules for them to participate wherever they needed to do so. Another good example is our registry, right? Initially, we had a registry system that relied on two independent, we outsourced the registry services. We used two independent entities that managed our registry platforms for us. And 2 years ago, we decided, you know what? That's actually very complicated because they have to check the documentation, then we have to check the documentation. Anytime we want to change anything on a registry, we have to go back to them, we have to renegotiate the agreement, and it got to be a real cumbersome and problematic. So we decided, you know what, let's just bring this in-house and do it ourselves. So, you know, there's continues to be evolution in this, but I think in many ways we've been able to leverage the private sector and kind of the capacities that exist out there. Another good one is on the auditing, right? So a lot of people ask us, so do you do the audits? And we don't audit the projects ourselves, but we audit the auditors. So we're selective about when we intervene, who we oversee, you know, which site visits we come along to. And we have kind of a set of risk criteria that we use to really, you know, make sure that we're capturing the kind of the places where we need to be involved in the oversight. For example, whether it's a first project by a project developer or the first time a new methodology is used, right? We have ways of making sure that we're not undermining or making the system too cumbersome, but that we give it again that credibility that it needs and that it's working properly.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting tension you point to, which is that you need it to be trustworthy enough to make sure that scams aren't getting through or that people aren't claiming credits that they don't really do. But you also need it to be agile and useful enough that it doesn't cost so much money that it makes it, not usable by people who want to make these credits. So because if it costs so much that they're not going to get their money back by selling the credit, or that it makes the carbon so expensive that nobody's going to buy it at those prices, then it is equally useless. So kind of having that balance is tricky. And it's interesting that you have in some ways open sourced the creation of these accounting methodologies and said, okay, you want a methodology around how you harvest wood in a particular project, write it up. We'll make sure it's properly done. This is what you need to address in the methodology, and if we approve it, then you can go ahead and use it, and a third party will audit that you're actually doing it. So how many methodologies are there, say in carbon, that you guys have approved that have been open sourced out there, would you say, roughly? It doesn't have to be an exact number.
I'd say we're on like 45, I think. I'd have to look. I can look at it quickly. But
so almost
I think we're
100 methodologies that people have come up with for different ways that you can reduce emissions or sequester carbon and then create a credit, right? That's sort of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Somewhere in the 40 to 100 range.
Yeah, so we currently approved, let's see, the latest one we approved was VM0042. So we've approved 42, but there are also a number of methodologies under the Clean Development Mechanism. The Gold Standard has methodologies as well. The Climate Action Reserve has methodologies as well. So does the American Carbon Registry. So some of them overlap, and some of them are somewhat the same. Some of them are rather different. But under the VCS program, there's 42 at least, and that's interestingly, just to talk about that a little bit. One of the things we found several years ago, we were getting, and we're starting to see this now, we were getting a lot of requests for methodologies, and we were basically giving equal weight to all of them, meaning we would kind of, run them through the process. It was becoming really time consuming because, well, there weren't enough validators or auditors to look at them. They then fell on us to review, but we learned that only a few methodologies were really being used. So a couple of years ago, we decided, well, actually, hang on a bit. Let's filter them up front. So now when you have submit a methodology, you have to kind of pass the test, right? Pass our sniff test. So we ask questions like, well, do you have the capacity to develop a methodology? Are there projects behind it? Do you have enough money to see it through? Kind of just basically real questions that help us assess whether it's worth our time to support the process. Because as I said before, we're now spending a fair bit of time with these methodologies. So it became a real time sink for us. So we needed to be thoughtful about how we actually enable kind of methodologies that are really going to stand the test of time. And so this has become very useful, particularly now, given the growth in the voluntary market, and we're now starting to see a lot more methodologies come through the system. So having those filters is proving to be really useful.
So you kind of developed a framework around which these methodologies could be done and have become better and better at deciding which methodologies you're going to allow through the system or not, and which methodologies are being used. Then you set up a process for auditing the auditors, as you put it, and figuring out who should be allowed to become a third-party auditor in your system to basically work with these methodologies, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that step in the process of how that has worked or evolved over time?
Yeah, that's a good question. So initially, we relied on the Clean Development Mechanism auditors, but we learned that wasn't quite enough and that we needed to have you know, those auditors used to be accredited under the CDM and under the CDM's accreditation program. And so that was a good first start, but what we learned is that it was better to have an accreditation program where we actually played an active role. The CDM held us at arm's length. So we started working very closely with the American National Standards Institute that has an accreditation program for auditors. And so that's really where most of the work has gone in terms of auditing under the VCS. But what we're doing, and so we sit on the committee that oversees the auditors. And so when we see problems, we can bring it directly to that body who basically, you know, can crack the whip on those auditors. And so we have a direct relationship through the accrediting entity. So that's turning out to be a very powerful mechanism to make sure that the auditors are doing what we need them to be doing. And it's also very interesting in the sense that we're starting to develop that kind of auditing or accreditation program around the world. One of the real problems and limitations under the clean development mechanism was that auditors tended to be kind of European companies, right? That were able to get through the system. And then you might remember this, when you needed an auditor, you had to call the guys in Norway or the guys in Switzerland. They had to send someone, you know, from over yonder to your project in Brazil. And they eventually figured out how to have local partnerships.
There were never enough of them. So, you know, you would always be fighting to try and get an auditor, and they would go, yeah, maybe we'll get to your project, you know, 10 months from now, down the line.
Exactly. And so what we're doing now is working with local accreditation programs that operate under what's called the International Accreditation Forum. So in Colombia, that now has a carbon tax that you can use, where you can surrender a carbon credit instead of paying the carbon tax. We're working with the government and the local accreditation entity to develop an accreditation program so that local auditors can actually work through that system, get audited. You develop local auditors and you develop local capacity, and you have much more ready access to, you know, capable auditors. We're trying to do the same thing in South Africa that's got a similar system, but that's our model for going forward. Let's work with accreditation entities around the world that can develop localized programs and enable local auditors to develop the skills and capacities to audit these programs, these projects.
So then the third piece of this stool is the registry system. So you've created, basically, it's kind of like a very fancy spreadsheet that says, tracks who owns what and who sells it to who and when has it been sold, and therefore is not available to be sold again. So, you know, you've developed that system initially, you contracted out. Ceci, I wonder if we could bring you in here to sort of bring it all together for us and talk a little bit about how this applies in one specific area, which is the area you work in RED on a project. How are you seeing this play out on a day-to-day basis on projects that apply to RED, deforestation in, you know, Amazonia or Mexico or Colombia or Indonesia or what have you? How does this actually work on the project level?
Sure. So for RED, I just want to make clear that we have two different areas in Verra. So we have the project level activities. That's basically what David was just describing. So a project would have to choose a methodology that would apply to them. So there are a few RED plus methodologies. So a project developer would actually go and review those and see which one applies better to their specific local conditions. And then they would go through a whole process that Verra has on how to they have to list the project, then they have to validate the project, and then they verify the project. So it's a process that Verra has that delineates very clearly how a project developer goes through a project after they follow the methodology. As David mentioned,
it takes how long to go through that process roughly, and is it very expensive?
It depends, I guess, how expensive it is. I guess it depends on the project that you're developing. That's a question that we usually get, and I guess it depends, and it's hard to answer. How long does it take? David, I would think from 6 months to a year, also depending on the methodology that they're following and how long it takes usually to get all the data and everything in. Some are more complicated than others, especially when we're talking about RED. There are a number of requirements that make it quite complicated in some aspects, like you have to develop what we call a reference level or a baseline, which is the benchmark to which you measure how your emission reductions, like once you monitor it, you measure it against that benchmark. So defining your baseline can be technically complicated or challenging, but then you also have the whole social and environmental safeguards that you have to comply with. You have to demonstrate program ownership. So it's not just the technical stuff that you have to develop in a project, it's also all the other requirements that we have, like you have to prove that it's additional, you have to calculate the buffer pool, ensure that there's no leakage, or how you're going to address or mitigate leakage. So it can be, it can take a few months to develop a project.
And you mentioned that this, sorry, you were talking about this happening at the project level.
Yeah.
And then there's another category, which is the jurisdictional RED. What does that mean and how does that happen?
Yeah, so the jurisdictional RED basically means that the project or the proponent is not like a project, it's the jurisdiction. And here we're mentioning it's like the government. The government is proposing the jurisdictional program and it takes place at the jurisdictional level. And by jurisdiction, it could be a state or it could be a national level. So we're talking a broader scale. And here we still have the same requirements. They do have to have the non-permanence, leakage, additionality. It's very similar to the requirements at the project level, but very specific for jurisdictions. And it is a bit different because also we can't tell the government what they have to do, right? In the end, they have some sovereignty about their decisions. So we can set a number of requirements that they have to follow. And in some of them, it is the jurisdiction that it's going to decide how they address some of the issues. And then we have that jurisdictional level, and then we have the project level. And what we're currently updating is our nesting requirements. And basically nesting is how you integrate those project level activities into a jurisdictional framework. And that's, I think, where the market is leading us towards that integration between projects and jurisdictions for many reasons. But so those are the two levels that we're working with, and that nesting integration between the two of them.
This is an important subject, but maybe you can help us understand. So why did we feel we needed a jurisdictional level as opposed to just working at the project level? What are the problems that you were trying to address by creating this system that works not at the level of the project, but at the level of the state or the national government or whatever the jurisdiction might be?
Yeah, I think RED Plus from the beginning was meant to be at the national level, right? Because that way you can see what's happening from like a higher, like a broader scale, right? You can address the drivers through policy alignment, a number of things, right? So you know what's happening at the bigger scale. However, as we have seen throughout the years, it is very difficult for governments to get to those, to comply with all the requirements, right? Many countries don't have the institutional arrangements, the governance, the technical capacity to do it. So what started to happen is that the private sector, which is much more agile, and you have finance right there, you can start working at the project level much faster, right? So I think in the end, what we need is both. We need the project level activities that can get private money, that have very specific local impacts, but then you need the jurisdictional level so that you know that the accounting and the monitoring is done and the drivers are addressed at a broader scale to really create a larger impact. Not that the projects don't create impact, but I think it's a larger impact.
Yeah.
Plus it helps you. Right. Sorry, go ahead, David.
Well, I was just going to add that, you look at stuff like the Warsaw Framework on RED, right? And there's this, there's an ongoing discussion about how we get governments to protect their forests, and in particular, kind of the governments that have tropical rainforests, and how do we get them involved? But I think Ceci described nicely the conundrum, which is, oh yeah, that's great, let's get the governments to do it, but they don't often have the capacity. They don't often have the kind of the wherewithal, and they certainly don't have the risk capital, right, to kind of put it in a place where they think it's going to work. And that's where you have the project experiences being very, very useful, with people can identify the place where deforestation is happening, make some intervention, provide the resources to the community so they don't chop down the forests, and provide basic services. I mean, what we find in Colombia in many of our RED projects, one of the most recent ones was the first one that certified against SD Vista. It's my favorite hobby horse right now, but it's a project in Indonesia that took a palm oil concession and turned it into a conservation project and turned it into a rainforest, an orangutan preserve. And the way that they're making it happen and preserving that rainforest intact is that they're providing some real basic services to the communities that the government never provided. So they're providing a mobile health clinic for people, and the clinic goes up and down the river and provides health services to the communities. They're providing scholarships for kids. They're providing women in particular, but the communities in general, the ability to generate or develop new businesses in respect of shrimp paste and other food security issues. So they're really helping the communities survive, and they're using it with carbon finance. And that's just a good example of how, private sector action can really drive finance to the places where you need it in a way that governments sometimes find challenging, right? I mean, one of the big problems with the government is that if you have $1,000 to distribute and you might have 5 people who deserve it, you'll have 10,000 people lined up outside the door. So the ability for a government to dedicate the resources to areas where it's really needed is challenging just because of the governmental process. So the challenge is really trying to figure out how you marry these two and how you have the accounting add up in a way that really drives finance to the areas that need it. So, it's a fascinating area, and, Cecilia and team are doing a great job at helping to figure out how that stuff integrates.
Yeah, and also correct me if I'm wrong, but part of the driver for looking, pulling the helicopter up a little higher to look not just at a project but at a state or a nation is also this whole issue of leakage, of the fact that, if you're doing a project in one part of Brazil and stopping deforestation there, the same people who were going to deforest there now move next door, and effectively you haven't reduced emissions, you've just moved it to a different place. Whereas if you start looking not at a project level but at a jurisdiction level, like at a state or a national government, then they have to go outside the state or outside the country, and it just becomes harder and harder to do. But also you have, the Kyoto Protocol and other agreements which are pushing people, and the Paris Accords and other agreements pushing people to look at what it is happening at the national level, so that you can measure what is happening at the national level in terms of emissions, and then you can nest these projects within that bigger policy context, right? Or am I missing something?
No, I think you're right, but I think we need to be really careful when we use terms here and kind of what we're talking about, because leakage has, in my mind, my personal opinion, been overblown as a problem, because initially there was this concern, right? That people thought, oh, you're going to protect this forest, so immediately the drivers of deforestation are going to go next door. And that is certainly a threat. And if project design consisted of building a fence around forests and telling people to stay out, that is exactly what would happen. But what we've learned over the years is that these projects, like I had said before, are providing fundamental services to communities, and they're allowing them and enabling them to survive without chopping down their forests. So that's a very different mindset, right? If you do that effectively, your leakage is going to be minimal. So I think this idea that, oh my God, we have to go to jurisdictional because of leakage is the wrong way to think about it. I think we want to go to jurisdictional because we want to make the accounting tie up. We want to make the project baselines consistent with what's available at the jurisdictional level. It does help with leakage, there's no doubt, because if you're accounting for leakage at a jurisdictional level, you'll be able to tell whether the projects are generating leakage. You do that anyway at a project basis. So what we require projects to do is to have a leakage belt and measure it. But there are chances you may not capture it all. So yes, it is better, but I think you captured the other thing, is that people think that just by going jurisdictional at the jurisdictional level, you're solving all the problems, and you're not. You know, all you're doing in respect of leakage is you're just washing your hands of it, because we don't track international leakage because it's a sovereign issue. So, you know, it's not like all of a sudden we do a jurisdictional and we've solved all the problems. You still have leakage. You still have issues about baseline credibility. You still have issues about permanence. So it's not a panacea and a solution for everything. We still need to be diligent about how we enable these activities to take place.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So now that you've created this system that generates more trust in carbon, where do we go from here? What are your views on what's missing, what it might be needed going into the future, and just generally your views on where the carbon markets appear to be headed? Let's start with you, Ceci, and then move to David.
I think that's a very good question, and I'm going to respond more specifically towards RED and I guess the FOL part of it, and then David can probably has a bigger picture of the other standards. But I think for RED we still have a few things to work on. There is certainly the capacity, building capacities at different levels with governments, institutional capacities to really address the drivers of deforestation. So I think at least for the jurisdictional nested RED, we still have a few years to go before everything is settled. We still have a few things coming up, like the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, that we're not sure what's going to happen yet, if there's going to be trading. We have Corsia coming up. So I think there's a number of exciting things coming up.
To be clear, Corsia is the airlines, and what are they going to do with carbon, right?
Yeah, and so they do like a process where they say which credits are eligible to be traded, and Verra has been approved for a number of their methodologies and the standard. And for the jurisdictional, there are a few that are already eligible. So I think that's going to bring an interesting thing for the market. But I guess in the end, we all want, like in a number of years, that we are like at least in RED, right? Like all countries have addressed the problem of deforestation and degradation, that we are not going to need carbon markets anymore, right? So that's, I think, our ultimate goal. But like David said, he thought it was going to be a 5-year work, and it's been a bit longer than that. So we'll see. I mean, new technologies are coming up all the time that can be potentially used, at least for RED or for other projects or other methodologies. So we'll see.
And by that you mean technologies for measuring and monitoring, you know, satellite imagery, radar, that kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly. So more and more we're hearing, and we're getting contacted by these companies that are developing these interesting methodologies, technologies that could be potentially used for a number of things that could probably simplify and reduce costs, so can make these projects more attractive.
David, what are your thoughts on going forward, and maybe if that can bridge us to where do you see the future for Verra beyond carbon or beyond the current standards?
Yeah, I guess, you know, if you're going to bring the slide deck back, because there's 2 slides that might be useful here. But I think certainly you're starting to see a shift away from certain project types. If you go forward a couple slides, keep going. There's a few innovations on this one. Keep going again. Great. So this is a slide that shows, you know, the issuances under the VCS program. And if you go to the next animation, you know, it used to be that most of the projects in the system were renewable energy, landfill gas, or HFC or nitrous oxide emission reduction projects. So, you know, the early days of the carbon market. But over time, we started to see an increasing focus on what we call natural climate solutions. So if you go to the next one, you know, those were initially RED projects, so conservation, and again, and we're starting to see now a lot of focus on restoration and removals. And you see that on that graph in 2016, kind of the numbers flipped, right? We used to have a majority of non-natural climate solutions project credits, and now in 2016 it flipped. And so now we're starting to see more emphasis on natural climate solutions. Going forward, I think that's going to continue to be the case. I think two elements to that. One, a few elements. The first one is that there will be continued emphasis on removals projects. However, I think we really, really need to be careful not to let kind of the shiny new bright object distract us from conserving the pristine forests that exist already. Because if we do that, if we lose those, then it'll be a much harder climb to be able to address climate change. And you lose a tropical rainforest today that is literally millions of years of evolution that are gone in a second. And so we can't afford to lose that. We need to make sure that we're protecting those ecosystems. But going forward, I think there will also be interest in industrial solutions for removing greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. So you've already surely heard of direct air capture and other technologies. Those are currently very expensive, and there's no, certainly the prices in the market today are fairly low, and those would require much higher prices, but maybe over time they'll start to meet, and maybe that's where the market goes eventually. But I would say also that, I don't know that the voluntary markets are going away anytime soon. As I mentioned in my introduction, we're starting to realize that, the Paris Agreement even says, well, let's go for 2 degrees, but let's try to see if we can, hopefully maybe we can get to 1.5 degrees. Even 1.5 degrees represents a significant, altered state for the natural environment. Right now, we're living through the consequences of having a 1 degree world. Imagine this, much worse, even if we get to 1.5. So I think what's happening in the minds of a lot of corporates is that because climate change has now reached this level of saliency, companies, are kind of forced to do their footprint. The minute they do their footprint, they've created a liability, maybe not as obvious as a financial liability, but they've created an indication like, oh, I've got a footprint and I got to do something about it. So now they're starting to get involved in the voluntary market, and we're seeing a tremendous growth in the voluntary carbon market. And I think that realization and the use of carbon markets could actually help us get to a world that's better than 1.5 degrees, and I think that if the chip has really shifted in corporate minds that they need to do something about climate change and we need to go beyond 1.5, I think the voluntary market has a long way to go. In that process, though, I think we need to be sure and encourage the development of compliance mechanisms. So if you go to the next slide, this is a great slide from ICAO. And this essentially shows where the current emissions trading systems are focused and what they cover. So it's kind of, typical, this is economics 101, right? Or environmental economics. What do you regulate first? And you regulate the point sources. You regulate the power sector. You regulate the industries. You regulate the transport sector, the ones that you can actually know how many emissions they're generating. And so, but the more diffuse sectors, like natural climate solutions, agriculture, forestry, as you see on this graph, they're regulated only in one case. And in this case, I mean, agriculture isn't even on here, right? So as you start to see, hopefully, evolution of implementation of policies to meet the targets in the Paris Agreement, you start to see these sectors start to be regulated increasingly in economies around the world. But that does mean that, again, agriculture, forestry will be outside of the scope of regulation for the near future. Eventually, hopefully they will be. But there still should be enough room for there to continue to be action to help drive emission reductions in those sectors. Now, of course, as a standard setting body, that means we need to be mindful of what's happening, right? So if a country all of a sudden says, okay, all landfill gas sites must capture and destroy the landfill gas, that means we can't approve those projects anymore because they no longer meet that regulatory surplus. If they're required by law, they can't generate a carbon credit, right? So we need to be evolving in our assessment of projects to make sure that we're recognizing that. In fact, we've already done that. Last year, we eliminated grid-connected renewable energy projects in non-LDC countries because we felt that they're just not additional, and they're the likely ones that will be regulated when countries start to get on board. So, we need to be mindful of that, and that kind of leads me to your question of where we're going. I think from a carbon standard perspective, I think there's plenty of room to keep, there's plenty of runway for us to work, but hopefully it's in the context of companies reducing their emissions internally first, seeing what they can reduce outside, but also complementing, the evolution of regulatory measures that help drive down the emissions. In the end of the day, this market, the voluntary market, exists, I think, because governments are not doing enough. So in a way, I'd love to see governments really step up so that the burden is less on the voluntary market. But again, I think the chip has changed. I think companies will start to realize that there's a long-term role for them to play in this market. And beyond carbon, the Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard, the plastics work we're doing, we're constantly looking for opportunities where we can apply the same set of thinking and rules and confidence to generate new markets that will drive finance to good stuff.
And you're finding that the same approach of creating a standard, of creating auditing, of creating registries is needed and can apply in SDGs or plastics or water or other things, right?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't apply everywhere. I think we'll see. The proof will be in the pudding. I mean, we think that it will work in the plastic space. We think it will work in the SDG space. We haven't done too much on water. I know you and I have discussed this in the past, but if there's an opportunity, we'd certainly be willing to consider it. The way that those programs work is essentially by creating assets, right? So you're creating a carbon asset or a plastic asset in which someone can invest in. But we have other standards like the land scale standard that looks at broad landscape sustainability, that's trying to apply a framework to enable the measurement of improvement of sustainability across the landscape over time. That isn't quite an asset per se, but again, it's the rigor we bring to it regarding, clear rules, independent auditing, listing on a registry. Some of those are kind of good hallmarks of the kind of work that we do and foresee doing into the future.
I guess part of what's necessary to create these markets, you need the demand and the supply, and there's always been discussions of what comes first. Should you bring supply into a market that doesn't really have demand? Should you create the demand in order to have the demand bring out the supply? What you guys do is make sure that there is trust and certainty in a market, but you don't create the demand. And so what you need is a market where that demand exists or is being created. And it happened with carbon, and you say it's happening more with carbon, but is it there in plastics? Is it there in SDGs? Those are the sorts of things that would push you towards creating standards around a market, or?
Yes and no. I mean, I think we all know that you can't just have a philosophy that you build it and they will come kind of a thing. So when we develop new stuff, we're pretty diligent as we can be, about identifying whether there really is demand for something like this. And then if we do, like in the case of plastics, we then try to, this plastic standard is a really good example of developing it along with partners who are likely going to be users of it. So we're working with Danone and Nestle, for example. And pretty much they have pilot projects using our standard with a view that as soon as the standard is official, they could actually generate credits. We could have a use case, an example of the market actually working that will then draw the attention of others and drive more demand. So, I think in the past we might have been, I mean, with carbon, we were very lucky. We knew that there was demand, we created it, we hit the sweet spot, and we were very lucky that we hit the nail on the head. But going forward, I think it's really incumbent upon us to try to be thoughtful and strategic about where we spend our resources, because we could come up with a standard that doesn't have any legs or no demand, and it'd be sit on a shelf, and that's not going to do anybody any good. So we do spend a fair bit of time kicking the tires of the potential market to see if what we could do could actually move the needle.
So one last question before we turn to the questions from the audience. Maybe people start typing in your questions, because we're going to call on you to ask them. But going forward on carbon, on these other markets, are you guys bullish? And what are the signals you're seeing that make you bullish? Or if you're not bullish, what are the signals you're seeing that don't make you bullish? And are you more bullish now than you were last week or or not, and why, and just generally, where do you see the future? Either one of you can take it.
Ceci, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so I think for at least for red, I think we still see a lot of interest, and I think more and more we see the countries trying to address avoided emissions from deforestation and degradation. There are a number of buyers that we talk to constantly that are interested in this type of credits. As David mentioned, like there are new shiny things coming up. Like there has been a lot of interest, and we've heard a lot of interest on blue carbon, for example, and agriculture.
So blue carbon. What do you mean by blue carbon?
Blue carbon is our projects that are developed in, for example, mangroves and tidal wetlands, which are a bit different than other forest projects, just because of the conditions of the mangroves or the tidal wetlands. So Verra just released the methodology for that, and we've heard a lot of interest on project developers on blue carbon, for example. More and more we hear about governments wanting to go at the jurisdictional scale for REDD+. So I think at least for REDD, I mean, it's been going on for quite some time, and it's not as new as what just David mentioned, but I think there is still a lot of potential there.
And just to follow up on that, for many years we've heard, oh, REDD is going to be the next big thing. California is going to allow it, or the airlines are going to get involved and they're going to demand it. And, you know, people went out and did millions of tons of REDD projects, and, you know, California has yet to allow it into its market. It's moving slowly in the EU. And now with the pandemic, who the hell knows where the airlines are going in terms of having money to do this or not do this. Are you still bullish, even though, you know, it's still coming, or is that a negative? And I'm being deliberately difficult here because I am more bullish than I sound. But tell us why we should be bullish.
No, I think it's an issue that we have to address. I mean, we need to preserve our forests in a way. I mean, there's so much potential for capturing and sequestering carbon and to maintain carbon out of the atmosphere that I don't think it's a sector that's going to go away. It has been challenging, and it is challenging to. REDD has a number of issues that need to be addressed, right? I mean, it's technically complicated. You need the institutional arrangements. You have other issues like carbon rights that you need to address. So I think that's why it's taking so long. But I am positive that we're still going to see interest in forests and in REDD as time goes on. And I guess that's where Verra can provide, right? So that certainty that what we're providing in our requirements can provide certainty to the market. And I think that's something that in California, maybe they haven't gotten the right formula for that, right? We're currently updating our requirements. It's out for public consultation right now, but because we think that we can bring that certainty to the market when we talk about jurisdictional REDD and nesting. So I am positive that it will continue.
Yeah, I would echo that for sure. I mean, I think, you know, an important piece is, you know, the CORSIA, the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, has almost, we'll see soon, but they pretty much approved certainly the VCS program. There's a few little things that they needed to get sorted out. And if that gets approved, and potentially with some others that are in the mix, you know, all of a sudden those will be kind of legitimate tons. And I know the airlines are kind of on the back foot right now, given the pandemic. But I think that will provide a really important, you know, market signal for REDD and jurisdictional REDD. Overall, I'm pretty bullish. I'm very, you know, continue to be quite bullish on it. You know, there's a number of initiatives out there that are talking about scaling the voluntary market. You might have heard about this initiative led by Mark Carney, who used to be the head of the Bank of England and led the whole, task force on climate risks. And they're helping to lead a new task force on scaling the voluntary carbon market. And that's kind of the big buzz in the market right now. And that's the report just went out today, the draft report. I certainly encourage everybody to look at it. And that has the potential to scale the market. They've said they want to scale the market by orders of magnitude. So I think that they're starting to see the stars line up for the market to be quite even bigger than what it is today, which I think is super exciting. So I'm really quite bullish.
And I just add that I've been approached by lots of big businesses and companies who are becoming much more interested in this than they were 5 or 10 years ago, and asking us, where can we get projects? We want to address our footprint, and in a way that I hadn't seen before, and certainly with interest in natural carbon solutions and climate solutions that they didn't have before. So I kind of agree with you. I'm bullish, even though there's a lot of bad things that have happened over the last 10 years. There are also a lot of really interesting good things moving forward. And I'm encouraged to hear that Corsia is still on the case and could generate some demand for credits going forward. So let's turn to the questions from the audience. One thing, just quickly, I see Mark Beeston says, would be great to read more about this Indonesian SDV Vista project. Would it be possible to share a link afterwards or in the chat about this? Would love to hear more. Let me turn to Briony Morgan. Briony, if you want to ask your question, I think you can be unmuted. Brandon, can we unmute Briony? Are you still there?
Oh, right,
Briony?
yeah, that's me now. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hi, I actually have 2 questions, so maybe I'll just ask them both. And sorry if you spoke about this before, because I had a few connection problems during, and I might have missed some of the talk. But one question was about your funding or your business model. Are you able actually to run these standard systems based on user fees, or do you rely on grant funding? And does it, I guess that probably changes for different standards and at different states of development. And then my other question was just about the market development. Do you actually try and create market demand or support supply development, or do you really either leave that to others or just not get involved at all and wait until a market seems right to develop a standard?
Yeah, this is really, really good questions. I'll take the first one and first, but Ceci, add anything if you want to add. On our model, so far we've generally been okay with covering our costs with our fees. So every time you register a project, you have to pay a fee. Every time you issue a credit, you have to pay a fee. And every time you develop a methodology, you have to pay a fee. So there are fees attached to it. But we found that that's probably the best way to run an organization like ours, because basically it means we don't have to worry about going out and getting funding and then having to, worry about that. So we're the masters of our own destiny in that way. And so we've been very diligent about keeping fees reasonable in order to cover our costs. So that's a model that I in particular like, because as a CEO, it means that I don't have to spend much time at all fundraising, and that ends up eating a lot of CEO's time. So I can actually work on, on working with the teams and doing what I need to do as a CEO to kind of, build the organization and build the credibility of what we do. And in terms of the market development, so sorry, just to add to that, we have in the past.
Are you there yet? Are you able to finance your entire operations from fees, or where are you? We
have. And so we'll see how it goes with the plastic work, if there's enough demand. But, we have a projection for what that's going to look like. And so so far it's been working really well. I mean, when the market dipped in 2014, 2015, we had, we were looking at some dire situations, never anything where, looked too bad. But it wasn't looking pretty. If things had kept going the way they were going, maybe we would have had to do a lot more fundraising. Or figure out another alternative, but the market's picked up, and right now we're in a really good space in that sense. So yeah, our fees are able to cover our costs. In fact, we keep adding more staff because we're finding that we need more staff to do all the work that we're doing. And in terms of market development, in general, I'd say no, we stay away from that, and we let the market evolve on its own. But like I said, when we were looking at even with carbon, we want to be aware of what the market is demanding. So for example, Ceci mentioned the need or the interest by buyers in using more remote sensing technologies, right? If we had a deaf ear and we didn't pay attention to that, well, maybe someone else might figure it out. So actually we're spending time figuring out how we can actually incorporate that into our rules. So it's not as much as we're developing markets, but we try to be very in tune with what folks want, like this whole issue about removals, right? Great, let's figure out, we should be coming out soon with a new consultation on a new tool that should help removals projects. But again, we need to make sure that we're not ignoring the avoidance or the conservation projects either. So we want to make sure that we're providing the tools the market needs, but I would say that by doing that, we allow the folks who are able to kind of put boots on the ground and make stuff happen on the ground do that, and that's really our main role. We don't have the ability to kind of create markets kind of just by snapping our fingers, but we can help shape them if we write the rules in a way that helps those particular initiatives flourish.
Ceci, do you want to add anything?
No, but just as David mentioned, like when we get an interest from, for example, from blue carbon, then as an example, then we see how we can promote that market, or if people have questions, or if we can provide a training, or so I think we're pretty active also in participating in different forums and presenting what we do.
Great. We have another question from Shawana Humphreys. Shawana, do you want to ask a question?
Really interesting presentation, and I am really interested, especially in the landscape standard. And I'm wondering, it sounds like I took a quick look on your webpage at a bit more information on that. It looks like you're expanding into different types of commodities and kind of corporate commitments across landscapes, if I'm understanding it correctly. And I'm curious if you all are planning on incorporating some of the better established certification programs like Forest Stewardship Council certification or fair trade systems into looking at those landscapes, kind of working with what's already there, or if you think that there are limitations to those programs and you can develop something better. And so I'm kind of curious how you're going to work with those existing programs, or if you're just going to kind of improve on them. And then also what the credit or claim will be that will be generated through landscape certification or this landscape sustainability assessment. Thanks.
Yeah, no, great question. So yeah, it's a great question. I think to the first part of it, so we are incorporating those other standards. The unique part about landscapes that it's done at a jurisdictional or at a landscape level. And so we're working very closely with Rainforest Alliance, which, as you know, has a farm-based certification. And that's what a lot of those others are about. So fair trade is farm-based, I think, to a large extent. And FSC is obviously kind of on forest, but again, it's kind of at a plantation level. So it's not quite a jurisdictional or landscape level. And that's the nut we're trying to crack. But I know the team's been very careful and diligent about trying to incorporate as much of the other stuff that's out there in a way that makes sense. And actually, by working with the Rainforest Alliance, I mean, they're somewhat conflicted, right? Because they're working and their success has been on those individual farm-based certifications. But to their credit, they think that there can be more scale and more impact if you look at things at a landscape level. So they've really been great to work with to really think about what the next generation of standards look like from a landscape perspective. Sorry, I forgot the second part of your question, which was what again? Remind me, sorry.
What kind of credit or claim will be generated?
Yeah, good question. I mean, the generally high level, it's about improvement over time. So it's not a threshold standard like you've got to meet this in order to get to be able to make claim. It's about setting your baseline and looking at it across a number of different dimensions, including environmental, social, labor, governance, et cetera. I can't remember what they are, but you can see them on the website. So it's about improvement over time against those dimensions. And the claim, I think one key question is who's going to make the claim, right? So that's a really difficult question to answer because in some cases, the application of land scale is driven by producers. So in Ghana, for example, it's the cocoa producers who know that they need to control the deforestation and the social aspects of their production. And if they do that, their cocoa is going to be able to sell at a higher margin on the market. So they've been very keen in working with us to kind of get this going in Ghana. In Costa Rica, it's mostly about, gee, we need to actually restore these watersheds. So the focus there has been slightly different and the entities involved are different. So I'm not exactly sure I can answer your question, but I'm happy to have a look at the website or we can put you in touch with the team working on landscape who can kind of answer your question more specifically.
Just
Great,
on that,
thank you.
where do you see the demand for this claim? Is it producers? Is it bundled with the coffee I'm buying? Is it how do you see that market evolving to the point where there's demand for that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think initially we saw it as the corporate claim. So corporates were going to be wanting to source, commodities from landscapes that were managed sustainably. So it was going to be the Unilevers of the world, the Danones of the world. And like I said before, there are some cases where that's not the case, where it's actually the producers that want it. So I think it will probably be a mix. I'm not sure exactly how this will play out in terms of what the demand is. It's really elegant to think like, oh, Unilever, you'll say, oh, I'm only going to source from this jurisdiction or this landscape where I'm getting my products and I know it's on an improving trajectory. It's not quite that simple because Unilever gets their commodities from a number of different sources and it'll be impossible for them to do that right now. And maybe they're on a pathway to doing that over time. So it'll be interesting to see because I think you'll have to have a mix of who's making those claims and what claims they're making over time, which makes it thorny, but interesting for sure.
Do you think we ever reach a level of sort of standards fatigue where there's too many and consumers are like, God, not another label on the product, and where it becomes kind of less meaningful or less valuable?
Yeah, I think so. That's always a risk, right? And so, I mean, I think there's a joke kind of that goes around in the standards world, like, oh, we just can come up with a better standard than these other guys, and that does lead to standards fatigue. I think the trick is that standards need to play a role and add a lot of value. And I think over time, you'd see that in a place where they're not adding value, people are just like, well, we don't need this, right? Or we can come up with something different. But it is kind of an open space. There's open competition, if you will. We don't like to say that word amongst us standards bodies, but every day I go to work, I think, well, we've got to come up with a better mousetrap than the gold standard. And that's entirely fine. I hope that they're doing the same thing because we're trying to come up with things that are more agile, deliver more environmental outcomes, et cetera, cost less, et cetera. And that's good for the market, right? Because it gives people the ability to shop around and see who actually solves their problem best. And I think that in a way is good. It can lead at the extreme end of it to kind of standards fatigue, but that's kind of what you see. And we're starting to see this in CORSIA, where you have all sorts of new programs come along and say, hey, I want to be part of that too. And some entity is actually looking at to see if they meet those basic requirements. And if they meet them, then great. And we'll all, I mean, back in the day, you asked about the early days of the carbon market, there were like many more standards. But over time, the market decided that some were better than others. And so we've now narrowed it down to a few, at least in the carbon space.
Great. We have another question from Haruna Manu Isa. Are you there? Do you want to ask your question? Harun, are you there? Why don't I just ask the question he typed in, or she typed in? It says, how can carbon markets be extended and nurtured in developing countries like Nigeria?
Great question. I mean, I think from a private sector perspective, I mean, one of the key things that we find is critical, and maybe Ceci, you can speak to this, like land rights, right? One of the things we've got to have before we certify a project is that you have land rights. So if land rights are not there, it's hard to do a project. So there are some basic fundamental building blocks that need to be in place in order for someone to actually claim credit for a project that's doing something on the land. But and I don't know too much about what the landscape is in terms of kind of rules, regulations, and regulatory infrastructure that Nigeria has. But I would imagine that there's plenty of opportunities in the forest space, clean cook stoves, but also probably in the blue carbon space, like restoration of mangroves or wetlands. I would imagine pretty significant opportunities. But it really depends on being able to have folks who can identify what those opportunities are and see the opportunity and develop projects and then make the link. It's not easy, right? You have to find the opportunity, you have to get the capital, invest in it, and then you have to figure out who you're going to sell the credits to. And that's always challenging. But the growing market, it'll be easier, but it's always challenging. And people come to me and say, hey, I've got this great idea, I want to develop a project. I said, well, that's great. But I always caution and say, look, before you go down the path of investing in a project and making it happen, make sure you've got access to you've got someone who's going to buy these things at the end of the day. So you don't want to spend all your time and effort and resources in building a project, but then not being able to sell it, because then it'll just crash. So that's, it's really about managing those two parts of it. Ceci, do you have anything to add on kind of what you need for a basic AFLU project?
Yeah, and it's usually what we see is that there's an NGO or a project developer that's already working on the ground, that has access, that has contact with the communities, that can also have that link to the standards and understands how methodology works, that usually drive this. Or sometimes it's a private sector investment. We have projects in countries like DRC or Liberia, or we constantly get these type of questions from different countries. So there are project developers out there that would be probably willing to take a look at it. Usually these project developers in the private sector are the ones that then help, link with the government. They provide this support for the government as well. So if they want to escalate it to a red project at a large scale, usually that's how it works. So finding someone on the ground that can help, it's always a good idea.
Yeah, and on that note, I mean, I think you've seen groups like Wildlife Works or others develop projects in DRC, which is a very difficult country to do any kind of work in, but having that kind of push and emphasis and money to throw at developing these projects has led to projects on the ground being developed in all kinds of different places. And I think in part it depends also on what happens with the carbon market, right, and where the buyers are and how much demand there's going to be for credits. And if our bullish scenarios come to pass, then I think a lot of options are on the table. But if things go quiet like they maybe did 5 years ago, then it becomes much more difficult. So we're coming to the end of our time. I wanted to really thank both Ceci and David for taking the time to talk to us and show us this very fundamental building block of the creation of these markets. Before we go, I don't know if either one of you wants to sort of leave us some last words or last thoughts on standards, where they're heading, or what you'd like to see more of. That'd be great. But if not, I'll give you guys the last word. But before I do that, just so many thanks for spending the time. Really fascinating discussion, and a lot more to go into. And I'm sure just on carbon standards, we could spend days and days of conversation, and we're looking at many other standards. So Ceci, any last thoughts?
No, like I just said, I'm very positive that the voluntary and the compliance markets are going to keep growing, and that the standards are going to play an important role. And hopefully we'll see more and more jurisdictional red and red projects and FO projects. And like David said, these new standards coming out that promote sustainable development. And hopefully we can curb climate change. So, and thank you, Ricardo, for taking your time as well to organize these great seminars.
I always learn from you guys, so it's for me, it's I get a big return on my investment. I don't know if it's the same for you guys, but anyway, David,
Yeah.
any thoughts?
Well, just, parting thoughts as we think about the climate crisis. Again, I think the role of standards is going to be really important and will increasingly grow, whether it's for carbon credits or just the methodology and the thinking, the capital, the IP that's behind all the work that we do. People are going to be coming up with new solutions. They're going to have to be measured, perhaps audited and listed someplace. So we're really going to have to make sure that the solutions that people are putting forth actually deliver some real benefits. And so I think that plays both in climate, but also in respect of sustainable development. So I think, I'm very bullish again, and I think that we're kind of situated in a really nice spot for making a contribution to the future. But I wanted also to thank you, Ricardo, for keeping the conversation going, asking some tough questions, and keeping us on our toes. So thanks again. It was a real pleasure to be with you all.
And thanks, guys, for helping build the infrastructure that makes these markets possible, because I do believe that these markets are an essential building block, because what they're effectively doing is they're internalizing those economic externalities and creating demand for some of those economic benefits that we would like to see. And I don't think we win this war of protecting our environment, addressing climate change, addressing pollution, unless we really begin internalizing those externalities. And I don't think we do that without the kind of infrastructure work. And sometimes, the work that you guys do is really difficult, really detailed, and, gets into the weeds at times. And I think it's necessary if we're really going to move forward. So thanks for all you've done moving this space, and continued good luck. And thanks everybody for listening. As always, a recording of this will be sent to people who participated, and so it'll be out there. And I'm sure David and Ceci will be around to answer questions if you have them. We'll make sure you have contacts there, or you can just look them up at Verra. All their information is there. So thanks everybody, and we'll see you next time on this Case Studies in Conservation.
Great.
Thank you.
Take care, guys.
Thanks, Ricardo. Thanks, everybody. Cheers. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.